Welcome to Module 2 in PCC's 240M class. My name is Robert McMillen, and we're going to talk about configuring the Windows environment. So let's take a look and see what that means. We're in Chapter 3. In Module 1, we covered Chapters 1 and 2. So we're going to use Server Manager to manage our server. We're going to install, remove roles, look at the Best Practices Analyzer, configure hardware, and do some other checks. Also talk a little bit more about Windows PowerShell. So Server Manager is a place where just about everything that can be done to manage Windows servers as well as the Active Directory environment. It can be taking place all in just this one tool. This one tool leads to a whole bunch of other tools. So here's a look at Server Manager. And you can see on the left-hand side all the different roles that are installed. And in the configure this local server, you can see here's where you can add additional roles. If you want to remove roles, you have to go up to the top where it says Manage and go to the Remove Roles option. They don't make removing roles as easy to do as to add them. Now, any roles that have been installed, you'll see you can manage them on the left-hand side over here. But you can also go to the Tools menu at the top and manage any roles that you don't see there as well. So here's another look when you scroll down a little bit at the different roles that are installed and their current status. So if you see, oh, this is in black and white, it would show up as red as you see the all servers and local server would do. Then you can see a little box that says here you've got a problem with your server. You better click on this to figure out what the issue is. All right, so here we have the local server properties itself. So if you click on that, you can get a lot of information, IP address, the name, the domain, and also some of the top events that are going on, which you can scroll down to see a little bit more information. We also have the performance of the server going on as well. So you can take a look and do a baseline performance. So for most roles that you install, you're going to be using the Server Manager and the Add Roles and Features wizard. So there are different role services that you can choose to include or omit. So this is an interesting thing, an unfortunate naming situation. So if you want to install a server role, many times it has some sub things underneath it that we call role services. So you install the server role and then you pick which role services you want to install with it. So as I said, unfortunate. So roles generally affect everybody in the Active Directory domain, everybody in the network. So for instance, you can install the Active Directory domain services role, and that affects everybody who joins that domain. However, when we talk about features, which is the other side of this, you have roles and features. Features generally just affect the server itself. It's not going to affect everybody else. So for instance, you can install the Telnet client. Well, the Telnet client doesn't affect anybody else but the server itself. So a couple of the common roles for Windows Server 2016 is the File and Storage Service role. Allows you to set up various different file sharing, and you've got DFS in there, which we'll talk about in an upcoming course. You've got the Print and Document Services role, which you'll actually be doing in this course, I believe in Module 5. And allows you to manage network printers and drivers. Once you've installed a role and set it up, you've got to determine if you followed the best practices, because if you haven't, you could be vulnerable to hackers and malware. So you have to run the Best Practices Analyzer, or we call that the BPA, and we'll be doing that. When problems are found, you're going to see a report on the 3 different levels of severity. So as you can see here, we have information, we have warning, and we have error. There's different guidelines for using the Best Practices Analyzer, and you can take a look at the configuration, pre- and post-deployment performance, and BPA prerequisites. General steps for running the Best Practices Analyzer, which you'll be doing, is to open the Server Manager. So it's fairly easy to do this. Click the server itself. In the right-hand pane, you'll scroll down to where it says Best Practices Analyzer. And then you'll go to the tasks and you'll start it. And once it's done, you'll get a report that tells you how you did. So here's a look at the results of the Best Practices Analyzer. You can also pipe this into a text file where you can get more details, and you can share that information, etc. So you can see here that the server name is accounting, and there's several different warnings and errors as far as severity goes, and then it gives you a list of what those issues are. Many of these apparently have to do with DNS, name resolution. So it also gives you suggested fixes. So once it shows you what the issue is, it also helps you fix it as well. Hardware devices can include a lot of different things. You got disk drives, controllers, adapters, all these different things make up hardware. So Microsoft has come up with something called plug and play. What we used to call plug and pray many years ago because it rarely worked. But nowadays it works very well. So the ability to automatically detect and configure newly installed hardware devices. So basically you plug something in, driver gets added, and all of a sudden you're good to go. When plug and play doesn't work, you have to download a driver from the manufacturer's website and install it unless it came with in the box where it was purchased. Control panel, the devices and printers utility is used for many different tasks. Invoking the operating system to use PNP to detect new hardware. So if it doesn't detect it, you can invoke it to start the PNP thing. Although if it hasn't detected it, it's probably not going to work by clicking on this. So most likely, if it doesn't detect it, you'll just have to download those drivers, as I mentioned earlier. So here's what the control panel looks like when you first open it up in Windows Server 2016. Very similar to what it looks like in previous versions. Although Microsoft is moving everything slowly off of control panel into the system icon. It's every quarter or so we see that another thing has been removed from control panel and moved on to system, or they make it available in both locations. It just looks different, sort of like the Network and Sharing Center. So when we click on the View By option, you can view small or large icons. You see the more traditional look of control panel, which is what things used to look like back in the 2008 days. Here's where what the printers look like. And you can right-click on any printer and share it if you want. You can update drivers. You can do all different things. But basically anything that's plugged in to the server that didn't come with it is going to show up in this Devices and Printers box. Device Manager, used to check for resource conflicts and other things like that. We don't really have as many resource conflicts as we used to have. There was a time back in Windows 95 where we had them all the time. We had to manually assign RAM and IRQs and things like that. But nowadays you rarely see any kind of a problem with that. So we mostly use Device Manager just to see what's installed on our server, because the devices and printers shows us some things, but it doesn't show us everything. Device Manager shows us everything. It also tells us what memory they're using, which memory space they're using, what drivers they're using. You can disable a device, uninstall a device, update drivers, all different kinds of things. So Device Manager is far more useful than the Devices and Printers box in Control Panel. Something to keep in mind is driver signing. Not all drivers are signed. So Microsoft, of course, signs all of their drivers, and any drivers that come with a Microsoft ISO file that may be third party, such as HP or Canon type things, those will also be signed. But if you go and you buy something, you plug it in, it may not be signed. You could run the risk where the driver could cause the server some instability. You could also run the risk of getting some malware from the devices. I had a customer being brought down when they plugged a digital recorder into a computer, and it did not have a signed device driver, so it wasn't verified, and it loaded malware into the system that brought the whole company down. So, lots of things, risks that you could have if you don't have a signed device driver. And when you plug in, say, into a USB port at some device, it will come up and it'll tell you if the device does not have it and the risk that you run. Virtual memory, disk storage used to expand the capacity of RAM. So whenever you start up a computer, you never have enough RAM. By default, Microsoft uses a portion of the hard drive to expand that physical RAM. And it's called the paging file. So you're going to see it's called pagefile.sys. It's a hidden file by default in the root of the C drive, but you can also move it or make additional copies of the page file on other hard drives if you want. File caching is turned on by default, and it is a useful thing to have file caching. It uses an area of RAM already established for it, and it makes searching for things much faster and opening things up faster. If you turn file caching off, the server runs slow. So why would you turn file caching off? Well, the module that actually caches the RAM sometimes goes bad. And so one time I did have a computer where it just, the server just kept crashing over and over and over. I turned off file caching and the server stopped crashing, but of course it ran very slowly. So that's how I knew that the problem in this particular case was this chip that was causing the slowness. So I ended up being able to replace that, and then everything started working correctly. Server 2016 registry. This is, all Windows operating systems come with a registry, which has a list of all of the different software installed, all the settings that should be, the way everything looks, the way everything is set up. All of that is in the registry. So if you compare that to a Linux computer, Linux does the exact same thing, but instead of using a registry, they use text files. So they have a text file that says how many colors you should be seeing on the screen, or what size the video should be, or how the sound should be. In Windows, like I said, they use a registry. And it's made up of 5 keys. And you see these 5 keys in the registry editor. When you open it up, you can type in regedit from a command prompt. And you see the classes root, current user, local machine users, and current config. So it's a good idea to understand what each of those do. And we do go into more of that in detail later on. Lots of precautions when using the registry or working with it, making changes. You don't want to make changes just because somebody tells you to. First, you want to back up the registry. And then if you do make any changes, then you have to go back to the old version, then you may have to do that through a command prompt, which takes a lot of effort. So only do this as a last resort. Every once in a while you'll get some bad programming and they'll say to fix this, you need to go into the registry and flip this 1 to a 0 or a 0 to a 2 or whatever it is. And that usually fixes the problem. I did have one time a programmer that decided he didn't want to let people print. So the only way that they could print is if you made a registry change. And so I called him on the phone. It was a small company, and I asked him why he did that. And he said, well, why would I want to let just people print just because they want to print? So this is the mindset of the programmer. You have to keep this in mind. Programmers in general are not very reliable people. If you want to question that, basically every hack in the world and every malware was written by a programmer to take advantage of another programmer's bad programming. The registry is hierarchical in structure, made up of these keys, subkeys, and entries. So you've got the registry key, and that is a category division of information within the registry. Okay, that's great. You got the registry key. That's going to be the highest level. Then you've got the subkeys, and they contain one or more low-level keys beneath that. Then you've got the registry entry. So that's a data parameter. And then you've got the root key, and those are those 5 keys that we talked about earlier. So all these different parts make up the registry. And they're either made up of decimal, of binary, hexadecimal, all these different, and text, all these different settings that's in the registry that makes Windows show up the way it is. So I showed you earlier the 5 different keys, but if you open up some of the keys, you can see the subkeys. You can see the values on the right-hand side. So for instance, on the right-hand side, you see this name number 1, reg SZ, and then there's the data value right there. Every one of these subkeys has a default value not set, basically just a placeholder. You don't need to delete it or change it or anything like that. You just leave it there. Before working on the registry, it's important to have a backup of its content. It's really an easy thing to do. You can just right-click at the top level of the registry, and you can back it up. Now, it's a fairly large file size, so if you don't want to back up the entire registry, if you just want to back up the key that you made a change to, then you can just right-click on that key or that subkey and just back that up. And that'll be a much smaller amount. Windows PowerShell, command line interface or shell, customized environment for executing commands and scripts. As I mentioned earlier, running a PowerShell command is basically just running a bunch of scripts all in one place. And it's a great time saver. And you can make your own PowerShell scripts, and we'll be doing one of those in an upcoming lab in, I believe, 289 or 288, one of those two. Some of the tasks you can complete using PowerShell include managing files and folders, network tasks, all these different things that you see here. There's so many things that you can do with PowerShell. Basically, anything that you can do with a GUI, you can do with PowerShell, but better. You have a lot more options. And of course, there's a lot of things that the GUI doesn't do at all that PowerShell can do. So pretty much everything. So here's another PowerShell command. We showed one earlier, and this one shows the directory. And you can tell it's PowerShell because to the left of the C, you see a PS for PowerShell. So many of the non-PowerShell commands will work in PowerShell. Not all of them, but many of them will. However, no PowerShell commands will work in a command prompt. So unless you see that PS on the left-hand side, you don't know that you're in PowerShell. Server Manager. We talked a lot about all the different things you can do. After a server role is installed, you can use the Best Practices Analyzer, as we talked about and showed that. There's the Control Panel, shows Device Manager, which is very useful. And you can also run something called the System File Checker to go in and double check that your files are in good shape. We didn't cover that one here, but we'll talk about that upcoming. We've got a lot of different ways to protect our computer, making sure that we've got signatures that are verified, and we talked a lot about the registry. So we covered a lot of things in Module 2. This is Chapter 3 in your book. So you can go ahead and get started in your labs. Don't forget about the mini videos that are in to help you for any specific task you may need it. So that'll do it for this, and we'll see you again in Module 3.